This is Gamerverse, all things gaming, geeky, and good. Welcome to Gamerverse. I'm your host Erica, and today we're going to be starting our History of Video Games series, starting with the beginning of the at-home console. I'm going to be starting off with probably the hardest question you could ask about video games, and that is, who invented them? You're not really going to get one answer on this one. You're probably going to get three is my guess, maybe four depending on the age of the person you're asking. The number one you'll probably hear is Nolan Bushnell of the Atari fame. The next person who comes up most often is probably Ralph Baer, and that's the inventor of the big brown box, really the first originator of the gaming console. You'll also get answers to go way back to the MIT days with John Cormack and those guys, going back to the very first video game, Space War. And they really created that one just to show the capabilities of the computers that they were designing, not really to be revolutionary in the entertainment medium. The fourth name you might hear thrown around is Miyamoto, and you'll hear this maybe a little bit out of love, maybe a little bit out of age, and this is Miyamoto of the Nintendo fame, which is a little bit after the story really starts. Now, Nintendo's influence and market appearance were huge, but Nintendo will be the main focus of episode 2 of the history of gaming. They are just way too big for this episode. But we have to go through the stepping stones to get to Nintendo first. So video games are done in RGB, red, blue, green, and this can be thought of as bit-by-bit coloring, so kind of think of like a filled-in square. The more bits, the more color, definition, freedom of creativity, and just realism you can achieve. The Atari 2600, which is the first Atari to come out, and its most popular console, was an 8-bit console. But so was the Nintendo NES, which completely kicked its butt in terms of color and definition. But that comes down to power processing in space. Atari's 2600 really wasn't able to utilize its full 8 bits. For the first gaming consoles, imagination really was very important. Your main character might be a blob, a line, or some abstract geometric shape, but you still imagined it was your hero. In many ways, the at-home console story kind of begins in 1972 with the Magnavox Odyssey. Full disclosure, this was basically Pong in 12 different gaming incarnations, but it included these Mylar overlays you would literally stick to your TV set. This could change the game to be a hockey arena or a haunted house or anything in between. Now really, this was making more games out of the same system, really the exact same gameplay, but the systems weren't cheap, so in a lot of ways 12 games for one is a lot of value, especially if you're trying to have that arcade experience replicated at home. Now, I promise there is going to be an episode devoted just to the arcade experience, what it was like to go play these games on those big boxes in all of that noise in usually a very dark space. And I think you need that first-person perspective to really appreciate what it was like before you could just basically sit by yourself in your underwear on your couch and play the same game. It was only a few years later that Atari launched the 2600, which is what most people think of when they think of Atari, or even the first system that was commonplace in North American households. I mean, we're talking Asteroids, Space Invaders, Burger Time, Sword Quest, which I have a great story to share about that one shortly, Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, and all the fun classics.
Discover a world beyond your wildest dreams. Discover Atari. Pioneers in coin video games like Centipede, Tempest, and Asteroids that challenge you, excite you, test you like never before. Discover the Atari that opened your eyes to the world's most popular home video games like Space Invaders, Missile Command, and Warlords. Discover Atari. And discover how far you can go.
Atari almost managed an entire decade at the top before the crash. And it's probably because Atari had gotten so big towards the end that the treasures of the Sword Quest contest was being announced. Imagine this, listeners. A solid gold sword, a diamond encrusted chalice, a jeweled talisman are just some of the prizes available in this video game competition. In total, there were 5 prizes created for the Sword Quest contest, totaling $150,000, and this is the early 80s. And this is all just to promote a game. So a little background on this. In 1982, Atari was owned by Warner Communications, who happened to also own DC Comics and the Franklin Mint. So in this fabulous act of synergy, you get the Sword Quest contest. This crossover included a comic book, courtesy of DC, that depict the story of the brother and sister team that are emblazoned on this quest. You had to solve the mystery of the cartridge to have a chance to win the prizes, and the 4 winners would then go on to compete for the Sword of Ultimate Sorcery. I couldn't make this stuff up. Here were the prizes that you could actually win for each cartridge. For the first installment of Sword Quest, which was entitled Earthworld, you would win the Talisman of Penultimate Truth. For Fireworld, you would win the Chalice of Light. For the third game, which was Waterworld, you would win the Crown of Life. And for the 4th installment, Airworld, you would win the Philosopher's Stone. But we'll have to talk a bit more about that prize shortly. The 4 winners would go on to win the Ultimate Sword. So now you're asking, how do I win these prizes? And it all goes back to the first game in the Sword Quest line, Earthworld. If you happen to place certain objects in specific rooms, you'll unlock these numeric codes that correspond with the comic book. But unless you were aware of this connection, you probably completely miss what was being given to you. So for example, all of the rooms were marked after the zodiac. And so if you place, let's say, the grappling hook in the Cancer room and then the rope in the Leo room, you'd be given 2 sets of numbers. Then what the player would have to do is go to the comic book and find the right page and the right panel to discover a hidden word. On top of all of this, there's 52 pages. Now, there were actually 10 hidden words in these 52 pages, but only 5 were correct. There was actually an additional clue that you had to find to know which were the right ones. So just so you guys know, the secret message turned out to be Quest in Tower, Talisman Found. You can bet there wasn't a lot of people who made it far in this contest. In fact, it was reported that only 8 people submitted the right answer to Atari. 500,000 copies of this game were bought, okay? 500,000. That's 500,000, and only 8 people got through. For Fireworld, which was the second contest, 50 people actually reportedly got through. Though there's a little bit of inside chatter that the second contest wasn't quite as hard as the first. Who knows if that's true, but there was definitely a bump up in the number of people getting the right answer. Atari was really struggling by this point of the contest. The whole video game market was really struggling at this point. We're going to talk about some of the blamed reasons E.T. that were kind of blamed for the crash of Atari, but things were going down before that mess of a game came out. The third game in the Sword Quest series, Waterworld, never even had a proper release and was only available to people who belonged to the Atari Club, which actually allowed members access to some pretty dirty games that I will tell you a little bit more about later. This brings us to the E.T. story, and you can't talk about the fall of Atari without talking about E.T. But keep in mind that these are more like parallel events and not really causational. Okay, so there's an urban legend that goes like this. In a small American town's garbage dump, there's an entire load of E.T. cartridges, all returned from Christmas or unsold stock from the stores, that got dumped and buried. Hundreds and thousands of them. It was like burying a dirty secret. This is a really long-running urban legend that turned out to be, we'll say, true, not true. So now to parse the truth from the fiction. The good thing is, recently, the actual dump site was found and dug up. And yes, there were E.T. games in the hole, but there were also a ton of Atari's best sellers in that pit. This wasn't an E.T. dump. It was an inventory dump. I think a lot of the time why E.T. is blamed is more based on the timing of the fall of Atari. To be fair, it was a really crappy game that was put together in 5 weeks, which is nowhere near enough time to put together a game that should have been of that caliber. I'm not even sure the game was actually playable all the way to the end, because most people ended up in a pit they couldn't even get out of. As much as E.T. might have deserved to end up in a garbage heap, it didn't deserve the blame for taking Atari down with it. Many people thought of the market as being popped or burst at this point, and that can be attributed to Atari, Intellivision, and ColecoVision. At this time, the three of them were just flooding the market, and basically they were breaking consumers' trust. People didn't know what was good or basically a pile of crap, and these games again were not cheap. This flooded content also completely cluttered up shelves, so as much as I know that there were shining hopes of great games that were amongst them, it'd be really hard to find with all the other games that are vying for your attention, and most of them just weren't worth it. This was almost the death of video games if it weren't for the shining beacon just around the corner in 1985. And with it came the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included. He helps you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or action-packed Hogan's Alley and high-flying Kung Fu, each sold separately? Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
I'm going to save the awesomeness that is NES for the next episode, but before we leave off, there are a few things to clean up for this episode. So number one, and we'll call this the appropriate label dirty laundry of Atari because of their dirty games. Some of you are thinking that there's no way that happened, but it did. And there's even a well-known top 5, but I'm not going to get into mentioning all of them. I'm just going to talk about a couple of maybe more notorious, nefarious, or just silly ones. Let's start off with Let's Play Jungle Fever, where you are a naked man who is trying to save a naked lady by putting out fires with, what else? Your ejaculate, because of course that's what it's for. The next one we'll talk about is Cat House Blue, in which you are, well, let's call you a male escort, and you're visiting houses looking for the most money, the most bang for your buck, if you'll pardon the pun, and the most notorious of all these games, and one you might have actually heard of, is Custard's Revenge. The reason you might have heard of this one is because it is derogatory and demeaning to First Nations. So really briefly, the player plays Custer, who is a naked erect man wearing a cowboy hat and bandana, who has to dodge obstacles on his way to a tied-up First Nations woman. It was the most expensive game that Atari had on the market. The game's literature actually suggested to tell kids that the characters were simply just dancing if they happened to see the game. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. The last thing we're going to talk about is what happened to the rest of the Sword Quest contest, because we know all 5 of those objects were created and only 2 were recordedly given away. By law, the prize for Waterworld had to be awarded because it was an announced contest. I guess this is where things go back into urban legend territory. There was reportedly a semi-secret, semi-private contest that was held for the 3rd prize. Nobody knows any details of the name, place, or when this event supposedly happened. But what about the other 2? Airworld was never even made as a game and was never awarded as a contest, and neither was the sword. So what happened to these last 2 objects? Some accounts say that they were melted down, while other accounts say that they've seen the sword on, let's say, CEO mantelpieces. So in this one, I'm not sure exactly who you need to believe. This brings us to this episode's trivia question, which is going to be a little bit of a hint for the next episode, is what did Nintendo originally make before they made consoles? Thank you for listening to this episode of the Gamerverse Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at GamerverseCast, and you can follow me personally, Erica, at Frenemy Games, and get an insider's glimpse into my tabletop game designing adventures. Please leave us a review on iTunes and show us a little love, and maybe help other fantastic geeks like yourself find us. If you're interested in helping the podcast to keep going, please support our Patreon at patreon.com/GamerversePodcast. If you've got any episode ideas or inspirations, you can email us at thegamerversepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, gamers, this is Gamerverse, all things gaming, geeky, and good.